Good evening. My name is Colette Cummings. I'm the Director of Community Health and Community Benefit for Valley Hospital. Welcome to our live virtual event entitled Conversations, A Journey Through Grief. This is actually our sixth conversation program. I was very surprised by that this morning, but it is our sixth, so welcome. Just a few announcements before we start our presentation for this evening. During our presentation today, if at any time you have questions, please be prepared to submit them through the Q&A portal located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation. We will have time after the presentation to address some of the questions. This live event will be recorded and posted on our website. For a listing of videos on other health topics, please visit www.valleyhealth.com/tuneintohealth. We update the site frequently. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Sharma. She's the Director of Provider Performance and Experience at Valley Health System and VMG Chair of Specialties, Medical Specialties. Dr. Sharma.
Thank you so much, Colette. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kenneth J. Doka, who's a Professor Emeritus at the Graduate School of the College of New Rochelle, as well as the Senior Vice President for Grief Programs for the Hospice Foundation of America. He's a prolific writer and has authored numerous books, articles, as well as book chapters. Dr. Doka has held numerous prestigious positions and has been a recipient of multiple awards, including a Lifetime Award for his work in the field of thanatology, losses, grief, and bereavement. Dr. Doka has keynoted conferences throughout North America, as well as Europe, Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. He participates in the annual Hospice Foundation of America teleconference and has appeared on CNN as well as Nightline. In addition, he has served as a consultant to medical, nursing, funeral service, and hospice organizations, as well as businesses and educational and social service agencies. And without any further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. Doka to share with us his insights on journeying with grief. So welcome aboard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma, and thank you for your wonderful introduction. And I do have to say, when one time my son heard a similar kind of introduction, he was in his 20s, he's now around 50, and he turned to me after it and said, you know, that was something, Dad, and you know, because your kids don't always know what you do. And I was very pleased and said thank you. He says it really translates as you have no life. So I guess you can look at that in different ways. In any way, I am so delighted and so honored to be with you tonight. And my only regret is that I'm not with you in person, because one of the things that really can be so powerful in these sessions is the opportunity as the session ends. And again, I do want to encourage you to ask questions, but sometimes people love to ask questions individually and personally. And so while we lack that, we'll retain everything else. But again, I thank you for plugging in today, for being part of this and the like. Now, we always have to start with a faculty disclosure. And that disclosure simply means that I'm not going to be selling any commercial products or any services. I have no financial disclosures to do, and I'm not talking about any use of medicine or product that's unlabeled at all. So in any case, so let's begin. And you know, whenever I do these kinds of public lectures, and here's another thing I'm going to miss tonight, is I always like to get a sense of the audience. And while I can't see you, I would always ask these questions because I found that people who come to this often come for one of three reasons. Many of you are here, and I wish I knew how many, because you're in the midst of grief. You're struggling with grief, and you're hoping to find something here that'll help you on your journey and help you with your struggle. And so, you know, so certainly that would be one reason to be here. And then there's maybe a second group of you. And you're the person who said, you know, I hear Valley is going to be having this program, and why don't you come with me? And I'll pick you up, and I'll take you, and I'll be there with you. And at the end, maybe we can go out for a cup of coffee or a drink, or something, and I may be committing you to things more than you want to do, but I'm just saying there are good friends, and I'd like to know how many of you are here as good friends accompanying people who are in the midst of their journey, maybe in some ways being a companion. And then a final group of people who often come to these are people who are involved in grief as caregivers, maybe medical professionals, nursing professionals, maybe just people who, for one reason or another, really are here more from a professional standpoint. And I hope all of you will take out of this something that will help. Well, what can you expect? And I used to like to say, I don't have any magic wand. I wish I had some word to say that could just take away your pain. And I say that a lot. I don't have a magic wand. And a number of years ago, somebody who heard me found out my address and actually sent me a magic wand. But much as I try, it doesn't work, and it doesn't take grief away. But I think there are things we can do. A number of years ago, when I was living in Astoria, a funeral home in the area, now closed, Quinn and Sons, asked me to do a presentation on grief to their families. And so they invited a bunch of their families to come to a seminar, a grief education event, where I was going to be speaking, and the topic I was going to be talking about is very similar to what I'm talking about tonight. What helps when it hurts? And this was the first time I ever presented. I had been a faculty member. I had obviously I taught classes, but this was the first time I actually faced a group of people in the midst of bereavement to talk about the experiences that they might be having and what they could do to help themselves. And I was extremely nervous because while I presented papers and to academic audiences, I had never done anything quite like this. And when it was over, I was very curious to see the very simple evaluations that Thomas M. Quinn and Sons had given families and asked them to complete. And I never forgot what one person wrote on it. It asked what was good about the program and what were the limitations of the program. And under the limitations of the program, one person wrote, "It did not bring my husband back. It did not bring my husband back." And I never forgot that, because it really was a humbling notion that reminds me whenever I do this about what you can expect and what you can't necessarily expect. But then I had another incident years later, and one of my favorite students, and I taught graduate school, so my students were studying to be professionals in various counseling areas. And one of my students was a student, one of my favorite students was a student by the name of Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen was the kind of student you love when you're a professor. She always kept up on her readings. She was fascinated by the class. She would often come in during my office hours to chat about something she had read in relationship to the class, and she was a real delight. And a number of years after Mary Ellen finished the program, her younger brother, a young man in his 30s, was in a car crash and died. And having found that out through a mutual friend, a student who was a friend of hers, I went to the funeral. And after the funeral, Mary called me up and said, I know you have office hours on this day. Would it be convenient if I drop by? I just want to chat with you. And she came by and she said, I loved your course on grief counseling. And I loved learning about grief. And I used to talk it up all the time. And people would always talk to me. I talked to people about the course, what I learned and what you said. And she said, after my brother died, people would say, did the course help? And she said, I had to think about my answer to that. And she said, and I liked her answer, said, it didn't make it any easier, but it did make it more understandable. In other words, it didn't take away the pain, but at least I understood the pain. I understood the length of the pain. We call that validation. And that's a very, very important thing. So again, for Mary Ellen, that was an interesting response. It didn't take away the pain. And so many times when I do these presentations, when we get to questions, the questions are almost always a variation of a question, am I going crazy? It's been 6 months and I'm still feeling bad. It's been a month since the loss. I'm actually feeling worse now than I did before. Questions like that. And most of the time, the answer is no. That's just what grief is like. Now, let me tell you about one more story, and that's the story of Stanley. Stanley was very unlike Mary Ellen. He almost never spoke in class. And I had a whole theory about Stanley. I was about 33 when I started teaching graduate school. Stanley was in his 50s. He had run a dress store with his wife. And when his wife died, he decided that he didn't want to run the dress store anymore because it had so many memories embedded of his wife in that. But he made a good deal of money from the sale of it. And he decided to go back to school and get a master's degree, which was something he had always wanted to do ever since he was young. And I had a theory. My theory about Stanley was that Stanley would just sit in the back of the class and kind of look at me. And I kind of thought, well, he probably resents having this 33-year-old who he probably thinks knows nothing, teaching him about the aging process. And so one day we were talking about grief, and this was just a course on gerontology, standard introductory course. And all of a sudden, for the first time in class, Stanley raised his hand, almost in a way that I thought was challenging. And Stanley said, "Are you telling us that it takes longer than a year to get through grief?" And I, of course, gave the answer I'll give to you. There's no timetable to grief. It's a lifelong journey. And Stanley stopped me and said, "Do you have proof of that?" Now I always tell my students that, that you have a right as a student to challenge anything I say, to ask for my evidence basis. But quite frankly, when Stanley said that, that kind of annoyed me. And I said, yeah. He said, "Can you get it to me on Thursday?" That was our next class. And normally I would say now, with more confidence and more experience under my belt, no, I'll tell you what the sources are, and it's your job to find them. And if you want me to help look with you, I will help you. But no, I'm not giving you a bunch of articles. I'll tell you the sources, and it's your job. But I was so taken back by Stanley that I said, "Yeah, come on Thursday. I'll have the research ready for you." And so I was hunting for bear because I really wanted to show this guy that I knew what I was talking about. And so when Stanley came to my office that Thursday afternoon, I had a manila envelope full of articles that supported my position. And I think I probably just almost threw it at him, almost rudely. Here's the research you wanted. Here shows you, I'm basically saying, I know what I'm talking about, guy. So I go downstairs, and my office in those days was in the library, and the copier room, where there was a copier room in the library, and I'm seeing Stanley make multiple copies of some of the articles that I had just given him a couple hours ago. And you know how we always think everything's about us. So I thought, what's going on? Is Stanley making a complaint? Is he thinking I'm not saying something that I should be saying? And so I walked up to Stanley and I said, "Stanley, is everything okay?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "You're probably curious about this whole event, about asking for the articles." And, and I tried to be cool and say, "No, not particularly," but I was, and Stanley said, "My wife died about 18 months ago." And he said, died relatively suddenly. He said, "My friends were great. They were always around. They always invited me for dinner. They were really supportive." He said, and after the first year, and Stanley was Jewish, and in Jewish tradition, there's often a dedication of a memorial stone called an unveiling that takes place usually around the anniversary of the death. And in Stanley's case, it was on the anniversary of the death. And he said, after the unveiling, my friends would invite me over for dinner, but there'd always be a single woman seated alongside of me. Somebody who had not married, somebody who was divorced, and they were kept encouraging me to date. And they'd say, Stanley, it's been a year now. You should start dating again. You should get back in it. You're comfortable. And Stanley said, I couldn't operate with these women. I had no desire for another relationship, but I kept getting pushed. And he said, when you said that in class the other day, it was like a weight was lifted from my shoulder. It was a light that went on. There's nothing wrong with me, he said. I'm just grieving. And he said that was a wonderful gift. And I was impressed by his response. And I said, but what are you doing with all the multiple articles? And Stanley said, I'm making copies and sending it to my friends so they can better understand that I'm okay. And I thought that was wonderful. So what can you expect? And I think you can expect three things here. The first is validation, that you're not going crazy. You're just grieving. Second of all, we're going to talk about some things that are strategies for self-help. So we're going to offer you possibilities for coping with your grief. And here's the important part, is that grief, as we're going to say, is very, very individual. And we all cope with it in our own way. So when I say, here's one or two things you can do, you have to say what works best for me. I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I got a question. I was doing a group on how to handle the holidays right before right around this time, right before the holidays were coming, the fall holidays, Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, all those holidays. And a question came up, and this woman said, this is the first Thanksgiving that my husband is not going to be there. And she said, I keep envisioning this empty chair where my husband would sit and carve the turkey. And I keep wondering, who's going to sit in that empty chair? And so I said, I'm sure many of you, to the group of widows, I said, I'm sure many of you have faced this in the past. How have you handled it? And the responses were very, very different. Some people said, when my eldest son sat in the chair, or my eldest child, who was my daughter, sat in the chair. And some people said I couldn't deal to deal with the empty chair. So we did something different. We had a buffet this year. We went out to a restaurant. We did something entirely different. And other people said, well, I'm head of the household now, so I'll sit in the empty chair. Another person said, we'll keep the chair open and empty as a reminder that this holiday is different. Well, maybe there were a couple of other choices that came up. Which is the correct choice? Which is the best choice? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. It's the one that works for you. So when you hear me say, these are some things you can do, you have to ask the question, does that make sense to me? Does that work for me? And sometimes it may just encourage you. One of my best examples of that was a woman who said, I heard you talk last year, because I would come back again to this widows group, about the empty chair. Said, you know how we handled it? Said, my father was, my father, she said, was a great athlete, loved watching athletics. And, after Thanksgiving, he'd sit there and watch the bowl games and all those kinds of football games. Said, so every year what we do now is the grandchildren race. And whoever wins the race sits in Poppy's chair. And I thought that's a great way of understanding that story, that there's no right answer. And then I think the other thing is that as we hear stories of people who've gone through these events, we have the hope of shared stories. If this person can do it, then I think I can get through it too. So we want to be aware of that. Well, I've been in the field of grief for 50 years, and people always ask me one question: how can I avoid grief? I never want to have this feeling again. I never want to experience grief again. What can I do to stop it? And in those 50 years, I've actually learned the answer. I can tell you how never to experience grief again. You want to know how to do that? It's easy. If you want to avoid grief, all you have to do is avoid any attachment. Don't get close to anything. Don't get close to anyone. Not a price most of us want to pay. The truth is that grief is the price we pay for love. If we're going to get attached to people, if we're going to love people, if we're going to connect with people, we're ultimately going to have to, we may have situations where we lose those things and those people who are important to us. So let's start out by asking some very basic questions. And the first is, what to grieve? What is grief, I should say? And grief is a reaction to loss, not just death, any loss. We experience grief in the course of an illness, for example, when people can no longer take on activities or do things that they used to do. And again, it's any loss. It's interesting. The reason I have this picture here is probably our modern study of grief began a little bit over 100 years ago when Sigmund Freud, Dr. Freud, the famous Dr. Freud, wrote an article called Mourning and Melancholia. And Freud would always start with a case study. And I always thought it was interesting that the case study in Mourning and Melancholia, and that was an article where he was trying to deal with a very current problem, the difference between grief and depression. But what he discovered about melancholia, about this, was his case study was interesting. It wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a bereaved parent. It wasn't a grieving child. It was a bride abandoned at the altar. And I think we missed a lesson from Freud. I think Freud was trying to remind us right then and there that grief is not about death. Grief is about loss. And that's important because sometimes when we grieve, we have all kinds of secondary losses. Not only do we lose a person we love, but we lose other connections. My son is now 50. When he was 16, I was counseling a woman whose 19-year-old son had died from a brain aneurysm. And she said something that really gave me chills. She said, not only did I lose my son, but I simultaneously lost all of his friends. And I thought about my house and all these 16-year-old kids who wandered in and out of it, who grabbed a meal at our house, who used our pool, who were part of our life. And I began to think, if Michael died, which thank God he didn't, all of that would disappear as well. Those are the secondary losses. Whenever we experience a major loss, it's like throwing a stone into a pond. And there are all kinds of other losses that ripple around. And sometimes these losses can be disenfranchised. And that means that the losses are not acknowledged, they're not socially sanctioned, they're not publicly mourned. I first began with the study in my work on disenfranchised grief, inadvertently, when again, in a classroom, somebody talked about her experience of grief as an ex-spouse. And she said, nobody seemed to think that I had a right to grieve. And so we see disenfranchised grief a lot. We see it when relationships aren't recognized, non-family relationships, which can be very close, sometimes closer than family. We see it where losses are not acknowledged, like losses like divorce or other kinds of losses. Think of all the losses we experience, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, in COVID. Sometimes the person is not considered capable of grieving. Maybe persons with intellectual disabilities or persons with dementia, they still grieve. We may not always acknowledge it or understand it, but they're still grieving. And then there are deaths that have a stigma attached to them. If I tell you that somebody died from lung cancer, what's the first question you're going to ask? It's probably going to be, did they smoke? And if they smoked, there's less sympathy. And if I tell you that somebody just died of COVID, what are you likely to ask? Were they vaccinated? And if they weren't vaccinated, maybe your sympathy is less. And sometimes people just grieve differently. Maybe because of gender, maybe because of culture, but we all have different ways of grieving. I sort of have a same bicultural background. Doka, D-O-K-A, Doka as we pronounce it in the United States. In Hungary, it'd be pronounced Daka. My family, my father's side of the family are Hungarian Protestants. Very strong subculture in Hungary, known for its stoicism. My mother's side of the family is Martin. They're Hispanic. And one thing we're not known for is our stoicism. I'm not saying anything about bravery, but I always remember, even as a child at family funerals, my Hispanic uncles would pick me up and they'd hug me and they'd say, "It's okay to cry, Canito. It just means you love the person." And they'd put me down and my Hungarian uncles would squeeze my shoulder and say, "Be strong." So already as a young child, I realized there were very different ways to grieve. And whatever I did, it was wrong with at least half the family. So that was a quick lesson. And again, when we think of the COVID pandemic, we are just not fully through, but coming through. We all experienced so many losses that we grieved. Certainly death-related losses, but then also significant non-death related losses. Losses in schooling, losses in employment, losses in income, freedom of movement, relationships, and all those powerful losses that we never fully got a chance to mourn. And sometimes we almost disenfranchised ourselves. There was a wonderful article in the New York Times that I was interviewed for, and the point of this author was that that often the non-death losses were ignored and disenfranchised, but so many people experience those. And I think of my granddaughter. In 2020, my granddaughter was graduating from a school she had gone to since preschool. She was looking forward so much to the end of her 8th grade when all these great events would take place. A senior trip of some significance, maybe to Washington, maybe to Boston, maybe to New York City for a couple of days, a senior dance, a graduation, all those great events, getting the yearbooks and having a day you can run around in school and have people sign them toward the end of the semester. But with school closed, none of those events happened. And, and she grieved those losses, as we all grieve those losses. So what is grief? Simply, it's a reaction to loss. And it's very, very individual. We all grieve in our own way. Grief is like fingerprints. We all have our own. They're very distinct. They're very different. Because our relationships are very different. Because the circumstances of how someone died and the circumstances of how they lived and how we live are different. Because we get different levels of support. Because our health is different. And when we're not feeling healthy, it's harder to deal with stress. And grief is stressful. And because our culture and our spirituality are different. So again, each of us grieve in very individual and different ways. And it affects us in different ways. We often think of grief emotionally. And certainly we're going to talk about the emotions of grief. But we also experience grief physically. A number of years ago, in other words, especially when our losses are not openly acknowledged by others, they hurt our body. A number of years ago, a woman by the name of Jane Nichols, this is about 50 years ago, did a fascinating study in the early 1970s. And this was a time, if some of you remember, when we didn't spend too much time dealing with perinatal loss, with stillbirths and miscarriages. And Jane was one of the first people to do research on that. This was a time when there were no cards if you had a miscarriage or stillbirth, that if you got any quote unquote counseling, it was very elementary. You're young, you're healthy, go get pregnant again. But never was the grief that mothers and even fathers and family felt acknowledged. And the result is it often came out physically. And one of the things that Jane asked about was about experiences of physical pain. And the answer that and what happened is that that many of the women who had these miscarriages and stillbirths talked about pain. And I always ask the group, for a show of hands and for people to shout out, think about where the pain was. And the answer that I get was, in the uterus, or maybe in the breasts and heart. And those are the most common answers. And they were 2 and 3. But the biggest source of pain, going to sound strange, were the upper arms. But those are the muscles you use to hug a child, rock a child, and to pick up a child. So again, you can see how their grief was converted to physical symptoms. And then we have emotional reactions to grief, and they run the gamut of emotions. You name it, you can feel it in grief. Anger, of course, sadness, loneliness, yearning for the person, all these kinds of experiences. Sometimes guilt. Guilt's very common. Many of you probably remember the old song, "Love is a Many Splendored Thing." Well, Margaret Miles and Alice Demme, 2 nurse researchers, remind us that guilt is a many splendored thing. And people experience guilt in all kinds of ways after a death. She found 6 different ways. They found 6 different types of guilt. Death causation guilt. I should have done something. Should have brought him to the doctor earlier. Should have made him stop smoking. Moral guilt. This is a punishment for something I've done. Role guilt. I should have been a better. And you can fill in the sentence. Better sister, brother, husband, son. Grief guilt. I feel guilty because I'm not doing so well. Or survivor guilt. Recovery guilt. I'm feeling guilt because I'm doing too well in my mind. And then survivor guilt. I'm 80 years old and this person died, I should have died. Or sometimes you find it in siblings because the child who died is so idealized. So almost any emotion can be part of this grieving process. And I just want to say one more thing about guilt, because guilt can be very complicated. Guilt doesn't have to be rational to be real. In other words, there may not be any reason for our guilt, but that doesn't mean we don't feel it. Sometimes what helps is to ask the question, are other people experiencing it as well? It affects how we think. It affects how we behave. It affects us spiritually. And again, we all have different styles of grief. Some people grieve what we call intuitively. This is work that Terry Martin and I have done. That means they're very emotional in their grief. And other people more express their grief by their doing. One time we met a person, we were interviewing for this study, a person whose daughter died, 17-year-old daughter died, as her car turned a corner on an icy Maryland road. New driver, young driver, not wearing a seatbelt. And the car overturned and crashed into a neighbor's fence. And she was killed instantly. And the day that this man buried his daughter, he went out and started fixing the neighbor's fence. And the neighbor came running out saying, "You don't have to worry about this, Tom. I'll take care of it. You have too much to deal with." And he turned to her And he said, no, I need to do this. This is the only part of the accident I can fix, and I need to fix it. That was his grief therapy. Other people may want to talk about it. He needed to do something. And again, there's a continuum of these grieving styles. And again, the issue is that sometimes families get into conflict over these because they want somebody to grieve in the way that they're grieving. And how we grieve is not a measure of how much we love. So in other words, if someone is crying and someone is not crying, that doesn't mean that somebody loved that person more. It just means they're expressing their grief differently. And I like to say that grief is a roller coaster. And what I mean by that is many people look at grief, either they maybe have this whole idea that I'm going to go through stages, and that's a 50-year-old notion that most people in the field, think was historically important. It got us talking about death, got us talking about grief, but it's not a current approach to it. We realize the very individuality of grief. And we recognize that while there's not preset stages we go through, many people also have what I call an implicit theory of grief, that every day it's going to get better. But grief is more like a roller coaster. We have bad days and we have good days. We have ups and downs. For many people, sometimes the very beginning is not the toughest part. They're still in shock. They're very busy. Lots of things that have to be done around a death, and they're getting a lot of support. One woman said to me, the first day that I really plunged on the roller coaster was about 3 weeks after my husband died. And she said, when I went to the mailbox, there was not a sympathy card. And when I went to my phone coming home from work, there was not a condolence message. First time in 3 weeks that neither of them were there. And she said, I realized the world has moved on, but I'm still grieving. And so some of these times are predictable. We know the holidays are often tough, but some of them are not. Some of them may just take us by surprise. A number of years ago, a student of mine who I was supervising in her counseling told of a wonderful story. And she said that in this story, what had happened is that she was coming to see the client, my counselor, her counselor, and she told her, and the counselor started by saying, how was your day today? And she said, it was strange. She said, when I woke up today, I was really feeling good. She said, but when I went outside to the car to go to your office, she said, I really plunged on that roller coaster we talk about. And I said, and she said, is there anything, I said, the student said, is there anything that that might have caused that to happen? Is there anything that might have caused that to happen? I'm sorry for the distraction. I have a cat who's running up and down the thing trying to get my attention. My attention is on you, but I got to give her credit for effort. In any case, she said, and so my student was concerned. She said, do you think it was because you were coming to grief counseling? And the client said, no. She says, that's why I think I woke up feeling good, because I always feel better when I talk to you. And so she went home that day. They couldn't figure it out. And then she called my student the next day and said, I figured it out when I got home. And she said, when I got home, as soon as I opened the car door, I smelled the smell of lilacs. And the client counselor said, my student said to her, and lilacs remind you of your mother? Because she was grieving the death of her mother. And she said, yeah. She said, my mother had the worst taste in perfume. She said she would buy this big jar of violet liquid that had the strong smell of lilacs. And she said, I hated that perfume. And she said, every day, she said, every birthday or Christmas, I'd always buy her some very expensive perfume, and she'd wear it the next time I saw her, and then we'd be back to the lilacs. Other people may not show much of a reaction to grief. And some of you in the audience may be wondering if you're doing too well. And the answer is, some people have a comparatively limited reaction to loss. Part is just what's going on. They often have fewer losses or other stress. They've had a chance to say goodbye. They have an intrinsic spirituality that helps them, however they define that spirituality. And they have good psychological health. They haven't had a history of depression or anxiety, which can be complicating. But we can learn from this, these resilient grievers. They often had an optimistic mindset that said, I'm going to get through this. They looked at grief as a challenge that they had to surmount. They believed that even in the worst things, they can learn and grow. And they focused on positive memories. So as we look at grief, we have to realize there's no timetable. Over time, for most people, pain lessens. We return to similar, sometimes better levels of functioning. Sometimes we do much, much better. And yet we always continue a bond with that person. And this is important because sometimes people hold on to the pain of grief because they think if they let go of the pain, they're going to let go of the connection. And one of the first things I do when I counsel people is I'll ask them what they're looking for. And they give me the answer they think they should be giving me. I guess I should move on. I guess I should find closure. I always tell my students to bring closure to closure. And I guess I just should learn to live life without that person. And then I'll always ask the next question, is that really what you want? And most people will answer no. And I'll say, you'll never lose that bond with the person. And when the pain becomes less, and one of the first signs that you're beginning to do better with your grief is when you're able to laugh at a story that's now too painful to think about. We're always going to retain a connection to us. We're always going to have memories of people we loved. They're part of our biography. If you knew my mother and my father, you'd see part of them in me, as I'm sure your parents and your siblings are partly part of your biography. We have legacies. Over there on my desk is a list of things to do, color-coded. And so after I finish this seminar, I'll cross out the last piece on that, which was the seminar at 7 o'clock. My dad made lists. My son makes lists. It's a legacy. Sometimes we have extraordinary experiences, which also form a kind of connection. And if I were with you today, I'd ask for a show of hands about how many of you ever dreamt of the deceased? How many of you have had an experience where you felt the presence of the person, or maybe even had a sense experience of the person? How many of you have had a third party experience where somebody says something at the right time and in the right way that seems to be a statement from the deceased? All of these ways. Sometimes we have symbolic experiences. Lou LeGrand, who wrote about these experiences, talked about how he got interested in when a client came to him aglow for a counseling session. This was sometime after the death of her 16-year-old son. She said, Lou, I had the most remarkable experience. Between your office and my house is Tommy's grave. And every time I come to you, I always take a little time in the morning to stop at Tom's grave. And she said, when I was there today, there was a red hawk perched on it. He didn't run away. He just kept looking at me for a while and then slowly moved away. And Lou said to her, and that reminded you of Tommy? Said his nickname was Hawk. And he always used to wear red jackets. So they used to call him the Red Hawk. Again, all these different ways we maintain bonds. And this is the importance. The lessening of grief is not the end of memory or attachment. As I said, we enjoy them now, and we still may experience even years later surges of grief. We may be a 6-year-old woman, for example, and your dad dies when you're 6. And then 20 years later, you're walking down the aisle, maybe with your stepfather or your uncle or your grandfather on your side. And at that moment, you realize how much you miss that person, even in the midst of this joy. Well, what can help us? And one of the people who not only wrote about grief, but deeply experienced it was a colleague of mine by the name of Catherine Sanders. And Catherine Sanders said that people go through a series of phases. This is based on research, not, and she said first they experience shock, and then they go through a very painful period where the shock eases and they become aware of the loss. And then they often reach a phase that she called conservation and withdrawal. So to the rest of the world, it looks like they're back to normal. They're going back to work, they're doing their things. But she said, basically, that's all they're doing. They're just getting through the day. They're conserving their energy to do what they need to do and basically withdrawing from life. And she said that some people then will and some people will stay there for the rest of their life. And other people will have what she called a turning point experience, where they'll say, this is not how I want to live my life. One of the women in Sanders' sample described a situation where her husband had died some 6 years before. And she had a 5-year-old grandchild who lived close with her mother, this woman's daughter. And they'd come and visit her often. And every time she saw her granddaughter, she'd cry because her husband would never get to see her and never had a chance to see her. And one day she heard the little girl say, as her mother passed, is that all Grandma does? She just cries? And she said, I didn't want to be remembered then as the grandmother who only cried. And so she was able to to find a new sense of life. The picture you're looking at is my godson, Scott, who I took caving once. And that's at the very beginning of the cave. You can tell because Scott's clean. But caving is full of muddy and wet water as you essentially follow a stream through the cave. And there was a point in this cave where we had to do what was called the pinch. And the pinch is, and Scott was just 11, you have to bend down underwater, hold hands, and essentially squat through about 3 feet of water to get to the other end of the cave and the sunlight. And Scott at 11 was reluctant, and he finally decided he was going to do it. And I wanted to compliment him for his bravery. And he said, this is one of the things that my dad always talks about. And his dad was a good friend of mine. And I said, what is that, Scott? He said, my dad always says there are times in life where you have a choice to either grow up or grow down. Grief is one of those experiences. Your choice is to grow up or grow down. Bill Warden talks about certain kinds of tasks. And he says to get through grief, there are certain things we have to do. The first thing we have to do is, or not the first thing, but one of the things we have to do is accept the reality of the loss. And we do that by funerals, by rituals, by talking about the loss, by learning about our loss. And then a second task is we have to experience the emotions with grief. And again, we don't need to bottle our feelings. We have to find safe places, whatever these feelings are, however strong they are. Some people have much stronger feelings. Again, some people, as we talked about, are more doers than the like. We have to understand that any relationship of importance in our life is ambivalent, has some degree of ambivalence. We love certain things about the person, but the person can really drive us crazy. And part of grieving is to come to terms with our ambivalence, to recognize what we miss and what we don't miss, what we liked about the person and what we didn't like about the person. Sometimes we might have business we have to finish, something we wished we would have said or wished we would have done. And we always have to plan for difficult times. If you were my client now, I'd be asking you, what are your plans for the holidays? Again, reminding you that these are going to be likely difficult, and you have to figure out how you're going to deal with them. Another task is adjusting life without the person. When somebody dies, our life changes. We've already talked about secondary losses. So we sometimes need to assess what has changed, to cope with our loneliness, to draw from our strengths and avoid past weaknesses, to grieve all the losses we experience, those ripple losses, and to get support. And here's a good technique that you can do. And this is a good way to really understand support. If most people have support systems, and I hope that all of you are listening have some kind of people you can look for support. And when and so I would have you draw a list of your support system. Again, most people have it. Some people may have outlived most of their support system, but most people have it. And then I'd say, okay, you've got your list of names. We sure we got everybody on it? Are there people at work who should be on it? Do you belong to any organizations, any faith communities? Are there people there? So now we've got your list of people, and most people are surprised when they write it down, how many people that they really can draw from. And then I'll say to them, I want you to put in a D next to anyone who's a good doer. There are some people, you need them to do something, they're always capable of doing it. My next door neighbor, I can always ask when I'm out of town to bring in the mail. And I know that that mail is going to be in my desk. He's a good doer. Others are good listeners. And you need to, and if you need to talk, they're always willing to listen. You can call them at 2 o'clock and they're honored that you chose them to call. And then the third group are what I call respite people. And grief is hard work. And like any hard work, we need time off. And these are people who give you time off. You can go out with them, you can enjoy a movie, and they're never going to turn to you in the midst of dinner and say, but how are you really doing? Because they hope against hope you're not going to talk about it. But that's their gift to you. Their gift is to give you time off. And whenever I do this, two things happen. People sometimes realize they're not using their support system well. They're getting frustrated because they're asking their listeners to do and their doers to listen. And they learn to appreciate the respite people, the people who take them and give them time away from their grief. And then another way is we have to decide, how are we going to continue the bond with that person? And Catherine Sanders has 3 wonderful questions. She asked the question, what do I want to take from my old life into my new life? What do I want to leave behind? Maybe some of the guilt, maybe some of the bitterness. And what do I need to add? And then another task, a final task, is that sometimes we have to say, how does whatever our faith or philosophy is, how does it speak to us? What does it offer us? How do its beliefs help us? How do its practices and rituals support us in our grief? How does it give us a sense of community? And again, know that don't have to grieve alone. There are lots of books out there, lots of self-help groups, lots of counseling. So again, we can take credit on that. We need to journey with grief. We need guides. But here's the point: we can grow in grief. And again, some of the changes that people point out are that they've changed their lifestyle. Maybe they used to smoke, they don't do that anymore. They have a greater appreciation of life, relationships, and priorities. I think I've been in the field 50 years, and that's one of the greatest things. People always say, you've studied grief for 50 years, aren't you depressed? And the answer is no, I've grown from that. I realize the importance of relationships. I realize what's important. Sometimes we have growths in character. We have perceptions of strengths. We have an existential awareness. We realize that life can be unpredictable. We try to make the most of it. We may grow in skills. Our spirituality may deepen. Some of you may remember the work of C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis wrote a wonderful book, A Grief Observed. And he talked about in that when he wrote an earlier book called The Problem of Pain, he gave trite answers. But now, experiencing pain, he was able to accept that you didn't always, that sometimes, even though he was a man of great faith, faith can be a mystery. I always like this statement by Thornton Wilder: the highest tribute to the deceased is not grief, but gratitude. We experience that gratitude when we grow old. So again, we can nurture by asking Sandra's questions, by looking back and saying, what's lost? What's left? What are my strengths? And one of the things that can sometimes help us is rituals. Funeral rituals, we know, can be very, very important when they're done well. And then we can create rituals, sometimes in our grief journey, that help us take the next steps. Some of those are rituals of continuity. They're just rituals that remind us of our continuing bond. One of the first things we do at Christmas is when we put up the Christmas tree. The first 3 ornaments we put up are ornaments honoring my dead parents and my godson's dead father. And it's a way of saying, we won't forget you. You're still part of our holiday in your own way. Another ritual can be a ritual of transition. And a ritual of transition is a ritual that says, I'm moving in my grief process. The most powerful ritual of transition I was ever involved with was a ritual of where a woman was came to me and said, my husband died 3 years ago. I want to take off my wedding ring and start dating again, but I can't seem to take it off. Whenever I try, I start crying and I keep it on, but I really want to move on in my life. And we decided to do a ritual around it. Because as we talked about it, it was very important to her. She was Catholic. She put it on in a ceremony where she looked at this ring as a lifelong commitment, and it had been for her. But then every night when he was sick, and she said, my husband didn't do sick well. He hated to be dependent. She said, but every night when we got together, we after a tough day, after any day, and any day was tough. She said, we put our rings together so they touched and repeat our wedding vows. And so one day we brought her to the altar of the church she was married in, and the priest greeted her after the masses and said in front of her family and friends, were you faithful, past tense, in sickness and in health? And she could affirm that she was. And he said, may I have the ring, please? And she said it came off by magic. And what we decided to do was to interlock both rings. His ring was so loose, she took it at the last minute and welded to the frame of her wedding picture. This was done. And sometimes we need rituals just to say, I'm sorry, or I forgive you, or do you forgive me? And sometimes we need rituals just to affirm that relationship. Say thank you for being part of my life. We're approaching the point where we have some questions, I hope, but I want to make one point. If you were in my grief group, one of the exercises that I do is I say, today is November 9th, 2022. Suppose this is our last session. Suppose I meet you November 9th, 2023. And I say, Dr. Sharma, I haven't seen you for a year. How are you doing in your grief? What would you tell me? And most of the time people say, I'm doing a little bit better, or I'm doing way better. Every once in a while, you'll find somebody who says, not so good, and then you need to give them help. It's my hope that however much you're struggling now, in the next year, you'll continue with your journey in grief. And while it will have its ups and its downs and highs and lows, I pray it'll be a little easier than it is now. And that's my hope. I hope we have some, and my other hope is that I hope we have some time for questions. So let's go to questions. Thank you.
Dr. Doka, we do have some questions for you. The
Excellent.
first one is, could you speak to the difficulty people feel in year 2 of grief? It seems the first year is so hard, but the second year seems to be a time of being more aware of the grief.
Yeah, and I think that's often the case. That's why I said there's no timetable. Part of the thing is, I think most people think and know that the first year is going to be tough, but many of them sort of think there's going to be this timetable, and once I get through the anniversary, everything's going to be a lot easier again. And it's not. It's a long journey. And so again, I always ask the question, how long did it take you to build a relationship with this person that you're grieving? Well, we can't expect that relationship's going to be, that bond is going to be severed. It's never going to be severed, or even that it's going to weaken. So again, yeah, I think part of this is just validating. yeah, the first year is tough. But again, you're still in shock. There's still some things happening. Maybe the next couple of years, but there's no time. But chances are, the next couple of years you will see some improvement. And if not, we need to get you the help and assistance you need to maybe make that a little bit easier. Okay, next question.
Thank you. So this comment says, this is very helpful, but you don't talk about anger, denial, despair, however. Can you briefly tell us how you help people with these specific emotions, anger, denial, and despair?
Um,
Good question.
Good question. Yes. With anger, we really talk about we try to do two things when I'm working with clients on anger. And what I would try to do is simply say, okay, let's analyze. Number one, first of all, I want to validate anger. Anger is very, very normal. The term bereaved actually comes from a Latin root that would be translated best translated by a 70s expression to be ripped off. It literally means having somebody ripped away from you. And the result is that if somebody rips something away from me, my natural response is to be angry. So we have to understand that anger is very, very natural in grief. And it, sometimes we're angry at people around us, sometimes without cause. Sometimes the anger is just at the person who died because they left us. They abandoned us. Now, I don't mean that they wanted to do that or even tried to do that, but we feel that sense of anger. So then we have to look at how do you cope with anger and what kinds of things work and what kinds of things don't work. Lashing out, being self-destructive or destructive of others doesn't work. It drives people away. So what are some helpful ways to cope with the very natural anger that you fear? And again, I think that's important. I just want to say something. I know that some of you may have time demands. I don't, and I'm going to be the last one to leave to click out of this seminar tonight. So if you have a question, I promise you that as long as you're here with it, I will be here with it, and we'll get to all the questions that are answered. I may be committing the people at Valley Hospital for something, but I'm going to make that commitment.
We'll be here with you, Dr. Doka.
Okay, thank you. So we're not going to abandon anybody.
So
That's anger. Let's talk about despair. Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to understand what you mean by despair. It's normal and natural to be sad after a loss. Obviously, our life has changed. Obviously, someone we love. But I want to make a distinction between sadness and depression. And so if your despair has reached the level that we might diagnose it as depression, then we have to treat the depression. And then denial. I'm always curious about denial. I think it's hard to deny that we've actually experienced a loss because it comes back in so many ways. With serious denial, it can show some real problems. But so I'm not sure what you mean by denial. But again, I think as we talk about the loss, as we address it, and one of the things I always train my students as counselors to do is not to use euphemisms about death and dying. Not to use them. We actually have 600 euphemisms: kick the bucket, all those euphemisms for not talking, passed on, expired. One of my least favorite, expired. I keep looking at my toe to see if there's a date. Good until, like you'd find on expired food, good until March 9th, But in any case, we use a lot of euphemisms. I always tell my students when they're counseling people, the more you use the real terms, even in your own thinking, how will I deal with this person's death? Or that's very, very helpful. I think we hit the big three. We could spend a whole session dealing on any of those three. So I appreciate that. Rochelle?
So the next question is, what is the best way to access grief groups for people? I have people in my care who would like to join a group, but cannot find a good support group for grief. And they happen to be from Bergen County. New Jersey, where we are at Valley?
Okay, I would say the first thing to do is to do assessment of what groups are around you, and then do an assessment of what kinds of modalities. You know, there are obviously one of the things that came out of COVID was the beginning of virtual grief groups, and some of them have continued because they're non-geographically centered. Anybody can join them, and that can be an advantage to people who live in areas probably not like Bergen County, which are much more rural and much more difficult, and widespread. So I'd first do an assessment of what's around, and I think people are right. Not every group is the same. It also depends on your loss. If you're a parent, for instance, grieving a child, you might want to, at any age, whether you're 80 years old and grieving a 60-year-old child, Compassionate Friends, there are national organizations. So, so again, there's no quick and easy answer to that question, but start by looking at what groups are around you. Recognize that what I look for in a group are two things. One is, you remember we talked about Worden's tasks of grief, and we talked about those 5 different issues. Good grief groups deal with all of those kinds of issues, not just feelings, but but how you continue the bond, and how you're dealing with any denial. So you want to see groups that really are not just focused on one aspect of the grieving process, but really are saying, well, how do you adjust to life? How do you do all these other things that are part of the grieving process? And the second thing is you want groups that are solution oriented. It's not enough to sit there and share your feelings, So you have a whole group session on people talking about anger. And, and sometimes you can have what we call in those sessions shared anguish. If you think you have a right to be angry, you ought to hear what happened to me. People almost top each other off. What you have to have is you have to have a facilitator who's going to say, well, yeah, okay, but how did you deal with your anger? What did you find helpful and what didn't you find helpful? And you have to make sure groups have their own internal rules. One of the rules I have in my group that I was very, very strong on, for example, was that you can't tell somebody what to do, because grief is very individual. You can tell what helped me, but you can't say, here's what you should do. You might say, here's what I did, and that was helpful. So you want to make sure that the group has some kind of structure, some ground rules, is focused on all the areas of grief, has a good facilitator, even if it's and some facilitators can be just people who've had the experience and have come back to facilitate a grief group, and they're problem focused. So so again, check what's in your area. I think Bergen County is relatively rich in grief groups. So check, good source to check. 2 good sources to check with, just on a very practical level, are hospitals. Well, hospitals can often have information and often have grief groups. I'm going to give you 3: hospices and funeral homes. Funeral homes often are very cognizant of the grief resources in their community.
Are there any websites that?
Oh, sure. Compassionate Friends. Just Google grief groups. Sometimes there are self-help clearinghouses in some counties, and they can refer. So you just call up the clearinghouse and you say, "What do you have on grief?" And they'll let you know what's available on grief.
Thanks, Dr. Doka. The next question is, how do you get over the guilt, feelings of I should have done more?
Boy, that's a great question, but it's because grief is so individual, a very hard question to answer. And the answer is that's, sometimes what you do is, as you talk it through in therapy, you realize, I did all that I could. I had a woman, for instance, who was fixed on the issue that her husband died of lung cancer, and she was fixed that I should have made him stop smoking. Well, that's not realistic, but we talked that, and finally we had reached an impasse, and I said to her, Joan, I want you to sit back, I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to tell me how you would stop that person from smoking. And this is what she did. She sat there And so we went through all of these different things. And then I said, what was going on? Said, I thought about all the things I did, hiding his cigarettes, crushing his cigarettes. Said, I even got a water pistol one time and shot him in the face when he lit up a cigarette a few times. Said, none of it worked. There's nothing I could have done. I did everything I could possibly think of. Other times people may want to do a ritual, or they may want to write a letter, or there are variations of the empty chair technique. For example, I had one boy when his father died of cancer when he was 11, and he was visiting his father, and he had a baseball game, and he was really pushing his mother to get him to the baseball game, the Little League game. And his father said, and he almost had his mother out the door, and his father said, give me a hug. And he said, no, we're too busy, Dad. He said, we got to go now. I'll give you a hug tomorrow. Well, he died overnight, and the kid carried guilt for 3 years. And one of the exercises I had him do was to sit in a chair and look at an empty chair and apologize to his father and say, I wish I would have given you that hug. And talked about how it really bothered him. And then what was interesting is I said to him, I want you to sit in that chair and tell me what you know your father would have said. And he sat in the chair and he took off his hat and he says, is that what's bothering you, Sport? And he started laughing and he said, that's exactly what my dad would have started. So again, sometimes you can talk it through and sometimes you need to find some interventive technique. But guilt can be very complicating. So make sure you deal with that guilt in one way or another. Even write a letter to the deceased.
Mhm. Yeah. We have another question here. Wife is in end-stage dementia in hospice care. The pain of waiting for the end is enormously painful. I will experience twice the grief, and I don't know how to handle it.
And hopefully you'll find, I wish I had a clear answer to that. Hopefully you'll find the strength that you had and recognize this is a very, very complicated loss. And one of the ways you may experience grief is with a sense of relief, and then you may feel guilty about that relief, but that relief is very natural and normal because her suffering is over and your suffering is over. There's actually a book you might want to read that might be helpful called Liberating Losses, about that sometimes losses they almost bring a sense of relief to us, because we don't want to see the person suffer, and quite frankly we're tired of suffering. I hope you find the strength, and if not, reach out for it. Find it in your support system, and find it, if that doesn't work, by talking to some kind of counselor or some grief group or something like that. Don't sustain the pain. You don't need to. There's lots of resources.
Thank you. Can you give some insight to a person who has lost a loved one through homicide? It feels like such a specialized type of grief.
It is, and it is for so many ways. And I don't know the situation that you're experiencing, but this is one of the horrible realities of homicide. Most people are, about 80% of people are not killed by strangers, but by people they know. It's a domestic fight gone too far. It's people. It's a drug deal. It's all these kinds of things. So it's not unusual that for survivors of a homicide death to know and to have feelings toward both of the parties involved, both victim and perpetrator. It also, another problematic aspect of it is that the justice system may seem unfair. Somebody, killed somebody who you love, and they're getting 10 years in prison, and you're thinking in 10 years they're going to be out, and I'm still going to be dealing with my loss. The media can be a complicating factor. If it's unsolved, it's a particularly complicating factor. And again, it's sudden, it's traumatic, we don't expect it, and it creates all kinds of complications. My notion is that if you've experienced a homicide, join a group, even though this group is called here's a website you can go to, Parents of Murdered Children, POMC, Parents of Murdered Children. It's not just for parents. It has sibling groups. It has all kinds of other groups as well. But you probably want to be proactive on that. In other words, don't wait until grief hits you over the head, but say, this is going to be a complicated loss and I need to deal with it.
Dr. Doka. My next question says, my father had a new family in life after divorcing my mom many years ago. His death stirred up so many old wounds, anger, and resentment towards him and his second wife. It compounded the pain of the loss because my siblings and I felt we had lost him many years ago prior to his death. And reliving the pain and trauma of the loss of our family unit has made the grief multi-layered and complex. Do you have any recommendations about coping?
Yeah, you're describing a very, very tough situation, and I would strongly suggest again a grief group or a counselor. It really goes back to one of the first studies I ever did, which was on ex-spouses, that you're dealing with the grief of the divorce and the separation, compounded with the grief of the subsequent death. There's probably lots of ambivalence in that relationship. Your father was there for you sometimes, but not for others. Resentment, because maybe you feel he treated the other family better than he treated yours. There's a lot of complicating factors there, and and make an assessment. Can I deal with this alone? It is complicated, or would it be useful to reach out for resources?
Thank you. And I guess I just have a few comments. One attendee just wanted to share that when she lost her mom in 2011, she felt a kiss on her cheek before she passed away.
That's one of those extraordinary experiences, and we don't talk about those a lot, but they're much more common than you would think. And I don't say that in a demeaning way, but sometimes those are so special. I had one with my experience where one of my godson's fathers died. I think I mentioned the day before his 4th birthday, and his last request to me was to help with his son and to help raise him, and I did that, and and I'm still close with him. He's in his 30s now. But I always remember one time we took him on our family vacation. We always took him on our family vacations, but one time we were in the Bahamas having a great time with him, and he was having a great time with my son, who's 10 years older, but still just, looked at Keith as a younger brother. And as I walked on the beach one night, I just felt his father's presence overwhelming me. I felt, the only way I describe it is I felt that every cell in my body was being hugged individually. And there was a sadness to it, because I felt there was also kind of a sense of, I can leave now. You're keeping your promise. So again, we should cherish those experiences when they come. They're wonderful experiences. I'm glad you had that.
Thank you. One request is to repeat the Thornton Wilder quote, if you have it.
Yeah, let me find it. The highest tribute to the dead is not grief, but gratitude.
But gratitude. And then our last but not the least, the attendee said they don't have a question, but they wanted to thank you for such a wonderful, beautiful presentation.
I thank you, and I look forward to a time I can be with you and have all these little wonderful chats, both in the session and on the outside. Thank you so much for the time we spent together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doka, for such a wonderful evening.